Joining us now to talk about his upcoming reelection is the senator from Colorado. Sorry, it's the senator from Colorado, Michael Bennet. Senator Bennet, welcome back to Pod Save America.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be with you.
I want to start with just a quick reaction to today's news. Inflation remains stubbornly high. Everyone who's out there talking to voters, as you are, knows that this is top of mind for everyone else. The Fed has a very aggressive strategy of rate increases to essentially slow down the economy. A lot of folks are concerned that that is going to put the burden on working families by raising unemployment and slowing wage growth. Is the Fed doing the right thing? And if not, what else should they be doing?
I think they're doing the right thing because, unfortunately, I don't think they have much of a choice. I think they waited this is Monday morning quarterbacking, and I'll admit that, but I think they waited too long to do this. They kept interest rates at zero for too long. And I think the breadth of the quantitative easing probably was broader than it should have been. And, I've had this conversation with the Fed chair because of concerns that I had. This was before the inflation, concerns that I had about the cost of housing in Colorado, which has gone through the roof. There's no workforce housing left in our state, and that's partly the result. I think he disagreed with me. It's partly the result of a Federal Reserve that intervened and drove asset prices and the stock market through the roof so that people with cash can pay whatever it is they want to pay for housing in Colorado. I'm not saying they shouldn't have intervened, but I do think that was an unintended consequence of the intervention. And to your point, once again, we find ourselves on the back end of a recession, making income inequality worse in this country, creating, more, a country where the folks at the very top benefit every time the economy falls or grows. And working people, often, for them, economic recoveries over the last 50 years have actually acted like recessions for them. And I would say, a more important question is, can we hopefully claim that we're at the end of the Reagan era and the end of, this sort of supply side trickle down economics and an economics that privileged people that wanted to make stuff as cheaply as possible in Southeast Asia or China over lots of other things we could have privileged in our economy, like decent wages and like, having durable supply chains and our national security. And I think the bill that we recently passed that the president signed, the CHIPS Act, to my mind anyway, maybe the first step to trying to say we're going to privilege some other stuff, and we're going to bring the semiconductor supply chains back to America for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is our national security. But I think we ought to be thinking about other things too in the wake of the busted supply chains that really have caused the inflation that we're dealing with now, in addition to the rising energy prices that have been caused by an economic recovery and by Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
I mean, you mentioned the CHIPS Act. Congress has also passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which over the medium and long term will do a lot to reduce costs on things like prescription drugs. Right. But for voters who are thinking inflation is too high, the cost of gas is too high, groceries is too high, help me finish this sentence. Send Democrats back in the majority to do X to help you with
so that we can create an economy in America that when it grows for everybody, not the top 10%. That's what.
Are there specific things that a Democratic majority would do to help deal with the costs?
There are specific things I would want to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that first of all, we should reverse the Trump tax cuts for the richest Americans. We haven't done that yet, and we should fund Bennett Brown and Brown Bennett, which are the biggest tax cuts for working people that the Democratic Party has stood for in generations. That's the child tax credit that I've worked on for years, that I ran my completely unnoticed campaign for president on. But, we did pass that last year, and it cut childhood poverty in America almost in half. And it meant that families in Colorado were getting $450 a month to help feed their kids and to help pay their rent. Similar with the earned income tax credit, which I've worked on with Sherrod Brown for a long time too, that, benefited millions of workers with, that don't have children. I mean, I think those are the kind of tax policies that could help people in the short term deal with the inflation issues that we're confronting. And then in the short term, I think the Federal Reserve has to continue to try to do what it's doing, even though it has some of the effects that you described. And then over the longer term, what we have to do is, I think, repatriate these supply chains so that we're not seeing the kind of inflation that we're seeing right now, and have an energy policy in this country, unlike the one we had going into this administration, which was inflationary, terrible for our national security, and awful at reducing emissions. I mean, coal is up 20% since Biden became president. You know, we should have an energy policy in place that allows us to, over time, reduce costs, create energy independence and economic independence, keep Europe in the fight against Ukraine, against Putin for Ukraine, and that reduces emissions. And I think the combination of what we've got in hand with respect to natural gas and the Inflation Reduction Act puts us in a position that no other country in the world is positioned to, puts us in the position to lead that transition that I think over time is going to make a huge difference to people's pocketbooks in this country.
On this podcast, we talk about the closest Senate races in the nation all the time, or Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, et cetera. We don't mention Colorado very much, but you are up for re-election. There has been some rumors or some thoughts that maybe this is going to be a close race. Mitch McConnell's super PAC just gave money to your opponent's super PAC. I think President Biden's headed to Colorado shortly. What is the status of your race? How are you feeling about your re-election?
I mean, every time I run every race, like I'm 20 points behind. That's how and Dan, when you and I first met, I was running for the first time in Colorado, having been appointed to the Senate, and in 2010, you'll remember, was a terrible year for Democrats, because we had passed the Affordable Care Act, and I was out on the eastern plains of Colorado with a slide deck trying to explain, here's why I voted for the Affordable Care Act. I'm not sure I convinced anybody, but I survived. And because I did, and Harry Reid did that year, and Patty Murray did, we held the majority, even though it was a complete wipeout. And that meant 35 million people who might have lost their health insurance didn't lose their health insurance. I'm running the same way today, and as I did in 2016 when Trump won. That was a crazy year. And I think we're going to be okay. It's going to be close, and the race is going to close. And McConnell is spending money here. And we learned last week that a billionaire in Wyoming has put $4 million into a super PAC here to try to buy the race for my opponent. And I think people should know about my opponent. He's trying to claim that he's a pro-choice moderate Republican, and the reality is he voted for an abortion ban in Colorado 2 years ago that had no exceptions for rape or incest. He says that he doesn't support any of the federal laws that are being used to codify Roe versus Wade. He doesn't support Colorado's own bill codifying Roe versus Wade. He said he would have voted against the bipartisan gun bill that we passed, a bill that even Mitch McConnell voted for. He won't vote for it because he says we have too many gun laws. Doesn't support the existing red flag law that we have in Colorado, and he wants to make permanent the Trump tax cuts. So, I mean, I think this guy is he also opposes the Inflation Reduction Act, which, as you mentioned, caps drug prices at $2,000 for seniors. Finally, after decades, requires Medicare to negotiate drug prices for the American people and caps insulin at $35. And this guy says there's nothing in the bill to like. So the choice is going to be very clear for Coloradans. And I think he is way outside the mainstream. I mean, I of Colorado, I will confess that unlike his primary opponent, who actually was an insurrectionist on January 6th, he was not there that day, but he has said that he thinks that Donald Trump bears no responsibility for what happened on January 6th. And I think
it says a lot about the state of the Republican Party that simply not attending the riot on the Capitol is what makes you a moderate in this party.
I know, I agree. And I think it also, to me, it says a lot. This guy knows better, I'm sure. He knows that Trump blew the whistle that brought all those people there in their racist T-shirts and in their anti-Semitic T-shirts. But instead of telling the truth about it, he's just being an apologist for Donald Trump and saying he didn't bear any responsibility. It reminds me of Senator Cruz on the floor literally the day of the insurrection, standing in the well of the Senate, claiming that we were disrespecting Trump's voters because we weren't, basically having a recount. We weren't delaying the certification of Joe Biden's election. And then we got invaded right after Cruz was saying that. And when we went back to the floor, I went down there and I said, you know what? You guys are the ones disrespecting your voters and Donald Trump's voters because you won't tell them the truth and you know better. And even after we've been invaded, they still won't tell the truth. So you're right. I think it does say a lot about the state of the Republican Party.
Obviously, we want everyone who hears this interview in Colorado to get out and vote and volunteer and do everything they can for you. But we're also making the case to our listeners all across the country about the stakes of this election. Right. And about why it matters who's in the majority in the Senate. So maybe could you talk a little bit about what would concern you as someone I know who cares deeply about democracy, about the Republicans taking the Senate majority this fall?
I mean, first of all, if you think the democracy is fragile, which I do, and I hope most people believe that are listening to this, then Democrats have a moral obligation to win, not for the sake of Democrats, but for the sake of the democracy, because what's on the other side is the Republicans that are running in Georgia and Pennsylvania and Ohio and here in Colorado and in Arizona. These are not people that are committed to the democracy. And that's something I think we need to be really worried about. And I will tell you, before I was in this job, I used to hear politicians say all the time, this is the most important election of your lifetime. That's what people would say. And I want to tell you my very considered opinion about this, having watched Donald Trump get elected president, which should never have happened. It should never have happened. And it wasn't his fault that he got elected, but he got elected. And then being there on January 6th for that invasion of the Capitol by my fellow citizens, with those racist banners and flags. My judgment is that every election between now and when we expire is the most important election of our lifetimes, and we should treat it that way. We have to treat it that way. Amy Klobuchar is a friend of mine. She's going to be mad that I said this on your podcast because I haven't said it. I've only said it in Colorado, but I keep telling people in Colorado that I'm sick and tired of hearing Amy Klobuchar say that Minnesota has the #1 voter turnout rate in the country, because I know, and she knows I know, that Colorado has the second highest voter turnout rate. So what I've been pleading with people in Colorado to do is take that talking point away from Amy Klobuchar. We have an excellent system of voting in Colorado, mail-in ballots. We've got tons of early drop-off places and a nice early voting period, and ballots are going to go out next Monday. And I just hope that everybody votes like this is a presidential election, because the stakes are incredibly high. If we have Mitch McConnell as the majority leader with a pro-life Senate in the wake of Roe versus Wade being overturned, we have a Senate that wants to perpetuate the trickle-down economics that got us here to begin with, these incredibly staggering rates of income inequality and lack of economic mobility in our country. That in and of itself, I think, is the biggest threat to our democracy. And we've got to fix that. We need an economy that when it grows for everybody, so people can see, that there's opportunity for themselves, an opportunity for their families. Otherwise, Trump's going to come back again and say, I alone can fix it. That's what happens. That's when you lose a democracy, because people sense they don't have an opportunity, and maybe a tyrant can show up and tell you I alone can fix it. You don't need a democracy. You don't need the rule of law. You should expect your public sector and your private sector to be hopelessly corrupt, hopelessly bankrupt, and you're a sucker if you don't believe that. That's the dark vision he ran on the last time. And we need to cure the underlying circumstances in our society so that people do have economic hope for themselves and for their families.
Senator Bennet, I think that's a great place for us to end, where your GOTV message is one of two things. Turn out and vote like your democracy depends on it. And if that doesn't work for you, turn out to vote so you can stick it to Amy Klobuchar. That's right.
Just so you can take that talking point away from Amy.
That's right.
Exactly. Yes. Thanks for having me, Dan. I'll look
Absolutely.
catching up after the election's over.
Absolutely. Yeah. Look forward. Always fun to talk to you, Senator.
Great seeing you. Thank you. Bye.